Hello and welcome back to the History of the Mongols. I'm your host Kyle. If you could have taken a bird's eye view over the Eurasian steppe in 1236, you would have witnessed a remarkable sight. Over 100,000 mounted Mongol warriors, arranged in vast columns converging on the Kama River. Trailing behind them were nearly 1 million animals, horses, goats and sheep, as well as thousands of carts. These carts varied in size, from those drawn by a single ox to massive wagons pulled by teams. They carried weapons, siege engineers, and all the necessary equipment to construct formidable war machines. The largest cart supported luxurious royal gers, the felt-covered round tents used by the Mongol elite. As they moved, they transformed the landscape, both politically and ecologically. Nomadic Turkic groups fled before them, while new roads emerged from the sheer volume of hoofbeats. To keep to their strict timetables, the Mongols sometimes blocked or redirected rivers for their caravans. This force had one objective: to conquer as far as their horses could carry them. This was the Great Western Invasion, an immense expedition launched by princes of the Mongol dynasty, flung like a spear deep into Europe. The Great Western Invasion is arguably the most well-known campaign of the Mongol Empire. It featured prominent figures like Batu Khan, Mongke, Guyuk, and the legendary general Subutai. Many listeners may already be familiar with its broad outlines: the ruthless conquest of the Rus principalities and the decisive victories at Liegnitz and Mohi. This narrative is often portrayed as the crowning achievement of Subutai's strategic genius, with the suggestion that the Mongols might have pushed all the way to the Atlantic were it not for the sudden death of Ögedei Khan in 1241, which forced the princes to return home to elect a new great Khan. It's a dramatic and cinematic tale, but one that tends to simplify the true complexity of the campaign. Over the coming episodes, we will offer a more nuanced exploration of the invasion, examining the historiography and strategic decisions behind it to present a fuller and more accurate picture of the Mongol military apparatus. Mongol awareness of the Western Steppe had begun during the Khwarezmian campaign, when Jabei and Subutai led an expedition through the Caucasus into the Black Sea steppes. There they clashed with the Cuman Kipchak Confederation, the Rus, and the Volga Bulgars. We've discussed these events in a previous episode, but it's worth recalling that this was no mere reconnaissance mission. It was a difficult campaign that cost the Mongols dearly, including the life of Jabei. These losses demanded retaliation. Subutai may have felt a personal obligation to avenge Jabei, who had possibly served as a mentor. The Cuman Kipchaks, a loosely organised but extensive Turkic nomadic confederation stretching from Hungary to the Caspian, posed a particular threat. As fellow nomads, they shared many tactical advantages with the Mongols: high mobility, proficiency in mounted archery, and the ability to disperse and evade capture. Their potential to unify under a charismatic leader made them especially dangerous. In the ideology of Mongol universalism, which had solidified near the end of Genghis Khan's life, all peoples under eternal blue heaven were subject to Mongol rule. Resistance by the Cuman Kipchaks and others was therefore considered rebellion against the will of heaven. Subutai withdrew from the region in 1224, but that was not the end of Mongol engagement in the Western Steppe. By this time, the territory now known as Kazakhstan had been designated as the Ulus of Jochi, Genghis Khan's eldest son. Since Jochi had died in 1225, control passed to his second son, Batu, founder of what would become the Golden Horde. From this position, the Mongols had a strong base for launching further attacks against the peoples of the Volga steppe. Their nearest target was Volga Bulgaria, a polity ruled by a Turkic people distantly related to the Bulgarians of southeastern Europe. Located at the confluence of the Volga and Kama rivers, their influence extended from the Ural Mountains in the east to the borders of the Rus in the west. Bulgaria was a commercial hub, connecting Rus trade to Central Asia and dominating the lucrative fur trade and other commodities from the indigenous Finno-Ugric populations, such as the Mordvins and Bashkirs. However, Volga Bulgaria's position was increasingly precarious. In 1223, they had successfully repelled Subutai on the Volga River, a rare check on Mongol expansion, but that success came at a cost. Their strongest neighbour, the Principality of Vladimir Suzdal, was expanding into their territory and contesting their influence over the Mordvins, even making one of the Mordvin princes a vassal. To stabilize their western frontier, the Bulgars attempted peace negotiations with the Rus, hoping to prepare themselves for the anticipated Mongol return. The initial efforts to subdue Volga Bulgaria proved inconclusive. Following Ögedei Khan's ascension to the throne in 1229, the Mongols launched a second campaign into the region, capturing the steppe between the Ural River and the Volga, and overwhelming the frontier defences of the Bulgars. This offensive was led by the commanders Kokatai and Sonitay, though some scholars suggest that Sonitay may be a scribal error for Subutai. If Subutai was indeed involved, his participation was short-lived, as he was soon recalled to assist Ögedei and Tolui in the decisive campaign against the Jin dynasty. The 1229 campaign triggered a large-scale displacement of tribal groups, many of whom fled deeper into Bulgar territory to escape the advancing Mongol forces. Another assault followed in 1232. Although the Mongols wintered in Bulgar lands, they were unable to press on to the capital itself. These early attacks were relatively limited in scale, as significant Mongol resources were already committed elsewhere. Major contingents had been dispatched under Chormakun to complete the conquest of Iran, and others were engaged in the final push against the Jin, as covered in our previous episodes. With the fall of the Jin in 1234, however, those military assets were now available for redeployment. Although Song China launched attacks on the Jin borderlands shortly thereafter, Ögedei ordered only minor retaliatory strikes for the time being, shifting his strategic focus westward. In 1235, a grand Kuriltai convened in Mongolia, summoning the dynasty's available princes. True to Ögedei's character, the gathering began with a month-long festival, marked by drinking, gift-giving, and the ceremonial recitation of the laws and edicts of Genghis Khan. Once the festivities concluded, the Mongol leadership turned to more pressing matters. Ögedei appointed his son Kochu to guard the Song frontier, while mobilizing the remaining forces for a western campaign. The Mongol leadership believed that powerful and resilient adversaries awaited them at the far end of the continent. Intelligence reports compiled by Ögedei's only surviving full brother, Chagatai, painted a foreboding picture of the enemies they would face. According to the secret history of the Mongols, Chagatai issued the following warning: "The enemy people beyond consist of many states, and there at the end of the world they are hard people. They are people who, when they become angry, would rather die by their own swords. I am told they have sharp swords." Chagatai advocated for a unified campaign involving all branches of the dynasty, that is, the descendants of Genghis Khan's 4 sons by his chief wife, Berta. This proposal was accepted. Contrary to portrayals that treat the Western campaign as a peripheral endeavour, the sources show that it was a major operation involving key figures of the 3rd generation of Genghisids. From the Jochid line came Orda, Batu, Shiban, and Tankut. Representing Chagatai's lineage were Buri and Baidar, the former being the grandson of Chagatai through his favourite son, Moetugan, who had died during the Khwarezmian campaign. Ögedei sent his sons Guyuk and Kardan, while Tolui's line contributed Monkey and his half-brother Bojek. These names should be familiar. Batu would go on to found the Golden Horde, while Guyuk and Monkey would both serve as great Khans in the following decades. Also joining the campaign was Kolgan, a son of Genghis Khan by a secondary wife, as well as the renowned General Subutai, who was appointed supreme commander. While Batu nominally led the expedition as the senior prince, Subutai was entrusted with overarching strategic control. Ögedei had initially intended to lead the campaign himself, but was persuaded not to by the assembly, likely due to the immense risks involved and the declining state of his health. Each of the Mongol princes brought with them the military forces tied to their households and territorial appanages, resulting in an enormous and heterogeneous army. Estimates vary, but most sources suggest a combined force of between 100,000 and 150,000 troops. This army was predominantly composed of Mongol and Turkic horse archers, but also included a significant detachment of Chinese siege engineers. Additionally, representatives of other subjugated populations took part in the campaign: Tanguts, Uyghurs, Khitans, Yurshin, already subdued Kipchaks, and possibly even Central Asian Iranians. As a largely cavalry-based force, the Mongol army was built around mobility, flexibility, and devastating long-range firepower, made all the more effective by the vast, uninterrupted pastureland of the Eurasian steppe. There is evidence that during the Kuriltai, there was discussion of sending a large auxiliary force of Chinese troops. However, this proposal was ultimately rejected. Yelu Chukai, one of the leading administrators of the empire, argued that the Chinese were unsuited for the harsh climate and the demands of a long-distance campaign. It is important to pause and consider the broader strategic objectives of the campaign. The initial targets were clear. The Kipchaks and Volga Bulgars were to be subdued, and the Rus principalities punished for their alliances with these steppe confederacies. The broader goal was to assert Mongol dominance over the western steppe. But what lay beyond? Some later commentators have claimed that the European phase of the campaign was essentially a large-scale raid, rather than a premeditated conquest. Yet contemporary sources suggest otherwise. Hungary appears repeatedly in Mongol imperial documents as an explicit target from the outset. In the 1220s, the Hungarian king Béla IV, whom we will examine in detail in upcoming episodes, proclaimed himself King of the Cumans as part of a strategy to incorporate and Christianize the Cuman nomads. Rumours may have reached the Mongols that Béla was not only a titular leader, but the actual sovereign over the Cuman Kipchak Confederation. To the Mongols, who viewed the Cuman Kipchaks as sworn enemies, this meant that their so-called king was also their enemy. As the Mongols advanced westward and received more reliable intelligence, their understanding likely evolved, but the initial perception in Mongolia remained rooted in this conflation. Further evidence of broader intent can be seen in the writings of Friar Julian, who will be introduced shortly. In 1236, he reported that the Mongols openly stated their intention to attack Rome. Clearly, the Western campaign, spearheaded by members of all four branches of the Genghisids lineage, was not merely reactive, but part of a wider strategic vision that included Europe as a legitimate target. After the Kuriltai concluded, the princes returned to their respective ordus, the mobile headquarters of their military and administrative operations, to begin raising their troops. The armies departed in spring 1236, travelling separately with the intention of rendezvousing on the Kama River, near the border of Volga-Bulgar territory. At this moment, we are given a rare and valuable eyewitness account from a Hungarian Dominican friar named Julian, sometimes referred to as Julianus. He was dispatched to locate the descendants of the ancient Magyars, who had remained in the east after the Hungarian migration into the Carpathian Basin centuries earlier. His journey took him across the Rus lands, through Volga, Bulgaria, and ultimately into the heart of Magna Hungaria, what he called Great Hungary. There he encountered an Ugric-speaking people whose language, to his amazement, remained mutually intelligible with his own, despite the 4 centuries that had passed since the Magyar migration. These people were the Bashkirs, distant ancestors of the modern Bashkirs of Russia's Bashkortostan, though heavily Turkified in the centuries since. More immediately relevant, Julian was in Magna Hungaria and Volga, Bulgaria, at the very moment Mongol armies were massing just a few days' march away on the Kama River. From his account, we gain the impression that the Bulgars were acutely aware of the oncoming threat. They recognised the sheer size and power of the Mongol host, but they simply lacked the military strength to mount a viable defence. Julian even encountered Mongol envoys in the region, who had ridden ahead of the main army to demand submission from local leaders. Before the assault began, Julian departed Volga, Bulgaria, and returned home. As such, we are left without a first-hand account of the siege and sack of Bulgar cities, yet we know that the Bulgars had formidable fortifications and a respected military tradition. Unfortunately, they had been weakened by prior conflicts with both the Rus and the Mongols. In the winter of 1236, their capital cities were systematically destroyed, and the state of Volga, Bulgaria ceased to exist. While in the region, Friar Julian heard that Saksin, a Turkic settlement on the lower Volga, had already fallen to the Mongols. This suggests that the Mongols first secured control of the northwestern Caspian steppe before advancing on Volga, Bulgaria. This region was inhabited by the Kipchak Olberli Kanglis, members of the Cuman Kipchak Confederation, who had already engaged the Mongols in several earlier conflicts. Specific details about these confrontations are limited, but one notable episode stands out. As the Mongols approached, many Cuman Kipchak groups fled westward, while others submitted. One figure, however, attempted to resist Bahman of the Olberli Kipchaks, a regional leader along the Aktuba River, a tributary of the lower Volga. Bahman appeared in the late 1220s or early 1230s and sought to organise resistance against the Mongols. The principal Cuman Kipchak leaders had been killed by Jabay and Subutai in their campaign of 1222 to 1223, leaving few capable figures on the steppe to coordinate opposition. According to the Yuan Shi, a Chinese source compiled during the Ming dynasty, Subutai had explicit orders to eliminate Bahman. Before the final assault on Volga Bulgaria, Subutai led a vanguard force that scattered Bahman's army near the Caspian Sea, capturing his wife and sons. Subutai then returned to the Kama River to wait for the main army's arrival before beginning the campaign against the Bulgars. Reduced to guerrilla tactics, Bahman led a small force southward, harassing Mongol detachments as he retreated. In early 1237, after the destruction of Volga Bulgaria, Subutai ordered Monkey and his half-brother Bojek to capture him. Each commander followed a different bank of the Volga. They soon encountered an old woman who had been left behind by Bahman's retreating forces. She pointed them in the right direction. Eventually, Monkey and Bojek found Bahman's remaining forces hiding on a river island. Fortuitously, a strong wind pushed back the water, exposing a ford. The Mongol troops crossed swiftly and surprised the defenders. Outnumbered and unprepared, Bahman's men were annihilated. Bahman himself was captured and requested the honour of being executed by Monkey's own hand. Monkey refused, ordering Bojek to execute him instead. Bahman was cut in half, effectively ending all organised Cuman Kipchak resistance. After Bahman's death, Monkey and Bojek rejoined the main Mongol force, which had continued its campaign. The Bashkirs had been defeated and brought under control. Volga Bulgaria destroyed. The next objective was the Mordvins, another Ugric-speaking group whose name lives on in Russia's Republic of Mordovia. The Mordvins were divided into two principalities. Formerly under Bulgar influence, the Western Principality had come under the sway of the Rus, while the Eastern remained more independent. The Eastern Principality submitted to the Mongols and offered troops. The Western one resisted and was swiftly defeated. At this point, the Mongol army stood at the frontier of the Rus principalities. In late summer 1237, Batu and Subutai encamped on the Voronezh River to await the return of Monkey and Bojek. During this pause, they finalised their invasion plans, sent envoys demanding submission, and waited for the rivers to freeze, which would allow easier movement across their icy surfaces. The Ruslands were politically fragmented successors of Kievan Rus. Although they shared a common language, religion, and heritage under the Ryurikid dynasty, they had become independent principalities. By the 1230s, the most powerful among them was Vladimir Suzdal, ruled by Grand Duke Yuri Vsevolodovich. Unlike the Volga Bulgars, who had attempted to prepare for a renewed Mongol offensive, the Rus had learned little from their defeat at the Kalka River in 1223. They saw that episode as just another raid by the nomads of the steppe. Few rumours about the Mongols had reached them in the intervening years, so their reappearance in 1237 came as a shock. The closest principality to Batu's forces was Ryazan, which chose to resist. Its rulers, along with the princes of Murom and Pronsk, assembled an army to intercept the Mongols at the onset of winter. Their forces were crushed near the Voronezh River, their cavalry decimated by Mongol archery. On December 16, 1237, Batu's army surrounded Ryazan, erecting a stockade. 5 days later, on December 21st, the city's wooden walls were breached, using catapults and battering rams. The Mongols stormed the city. According to the Chronicle of Novgorod, they killed the knyaz and the knyaginya, and men, women and children, monks, nuns and priests, some by fire, some by the sword, and violated nuns, priests' wives, good women and girls in the presence of their mothers and sisters. The massacre was total. Grand Duke Yuri did not intervene. Some historians, like Alexander Mayorov, have argued that Yuri may have already submitted to the Mongols, as suggested in the Laurentian Chronicle, which claims he returned their envoys with gifts. According to the same chronicle, Roman Igorovich, brother of the Prince of Ryazan, fled with his druzhina, or personal guard, and reached Kolomna on the Oka River. There, the local commander, a subordinate of Grand Duke Yuri, offered assistance. The Mongols attacked and won the battle, though one of their generals, Kolgan, a son of Genghis Khan, was killed. The death of a Genghisid prince was a serious matter. Such losses typically provoked extreme retaliation. Whether or not Yuri had hoped to avoid conflict, Kolgan's death made further violence inevitable. Over the spring of 1238, Mongol forces ravaged the northern Rus principalities in response. Among the towns they destroyed was a small settlement known as Moscow, which fell on January 15th. Grand Duke Yuri retreated northward after the fall of his capital, Vladimir, on February 7th. In the process, his family was killed. Less than a month later, on March 4th, Yuri and a small contingent were intercepted near the Sit River by the Mongol general Boroldai. Yuri was captured and met a gruesome fate, though the sources offer only veiled references to the details of his death. Of all the towns in the northern principalities, only Torjok and Kozelsk offered prolonged resistance. Kozelsk, in particular, proved to be a bloody and drawn-out siege. The young Prince Vasilko led its defence with unexpected effectiveness. Batu's forces were unable to breach the city for nearly 2 months. When they finally opened a gap in the wall and surged through, they were met with fierce resistance and driven back. Only with the arrival of reinforcements under Kadan and Buri was the city finally overwhelmed. Before its fall in May 1238, the townspeople launched a desperate sortie, pouring out of the gates and catching the Mongols off guard. The defenders managed to destroy siege engines and kill the sons of 3 Mongol commanders before they were ultimately defeated. According to the Galician Volhynian Chronicle, the Mongols came to refer to Kozelsk as the Evil City, and the name became taboo in their ranks. Among the major northern cities, only Novgorod escaped destruction. This was likely due to a combination of factors: the swift diplomatic submission of its prince, Alexander Nevsky, and the spring thaw, which transformed the approaches to the city into a marshy quagmire, hindering Mongol movement. Nevsky would later achieve lasting fame for his victory over the Teutonic Knights at Lake Peipus in 1242, a symbolic triumph during an otherwise devastating era for the Rus. By May 1238, as the weather warmed, the Mongols withdrew from northern Rus to allow their troops and horses time to recuperate and to assess the results of the campaign. Why did the Rus suffer such rapid and total defeat? Between December 1237 and May 1238, the Mongols captured most of the northern principalities, with many cities falling in a matter of days. 2 primary reasons explain this collapse. First, the state of Rus military defences was inadequate. City fortifications were often constructed of timber atop earthworks, with stone walls rare and defensive towers even rarer. These fortifications were no match for the advanced siege weaponry the Mongols employed, especially catapults developed for breaching the formidable, pounded earth walls of Chinese cities. Compared to those, the wooden walls of the Rus were quickly reduced to rubble. Second, the Mongols possessed a level of siege warfare experience that far surpassed that of the Rus. For the Rus, sieges typically involved surrounding a city and waiting for starvation to force surrender. Siege engines were seldom used and military engineering knowledge was limited. By contrast, Mongol forces were supported by trained Chinese and Muslim engineers who brought considerable technical skill to bear. Furthermore, Rus cities were built on flat, open terrain, making them easy to approach, surround, and bombard with siege engines, unlike the hilltop fortresses common in medieval Europe. The geographic and structural vulnerabilities of the Rus settlements made them ideal targets for Mongol siege tactics. Another key factor behind the rapid Mongol success in Rus was the extreme political fragmentation among the various principalities. In the years leading up to the invasion, and even during it, the princes remained deeply divided, often preferring to let neighbouring territories bear the brunt of Mongol attacks in hopes of escaping harm themselves. This mutual mistrust and disunity proved disastrous. While the Rus princes failed to coordinate a joint defence, the Mongols operated under a largely cohesive command structure. Although tensions among Mongol princes would soon emerge, their leadership during the campaign remained disciplined and strategic. Mongol armies moved with remarkable independence and coordination. Units led by princes and commanders, typically composed of 1,000 troops each, operated across vast distances, linked by efficient couriers and synchronized rendezvous points. Rather than a single massive army advancing as one, the Mongol invasion unfolded as a series of rapid, decentralized strikes. For defenders in Rus cities, it must have felt like being surrounded on all sides, with fresh Mongol contingents appearing daily. Their movements were swift and unpredictable. making their forces seem both larger and more omnipresent than they were. Much like what had occurred in the Khwarezmian campaign, each city in Rus was left to face the enemy alone, allowing the Mongols to isolate defenders and concentrate superior numbers at individual targets, despite the often fierce resistance of local garrisons. By the time Batu Khan ordered a summer withdrawal in 1238, northern Rus lay in ruins. Archaeological evidence has confirmed widespread killings of civilians, consistent with contemporary Rus accounts. However, the destruction was not quite as absolute as sometimes portrayed. Some Rus princes retained enough economic and military capacity to resume internecine warfare in the years that followed. Still, their ability to mount any real military opposition to the Mongol Empire had been shattered. It would take over a century before the Rus principalities could field a serious military challenge against Mongol rule. Importantly, not all Rus lands were struck in this first wave of attacks. The southern and far western principalities such as Chernigov, Kiev, Galicia, and Volhynia had not yet been targeted. Furthermore, the steppe zone between the Caspian and Black Seas, inhabited by the Cuman-Kipchak Confederation, remained unconquered. These would be the next objectives for Batu and Subutai, following their summer respite in 1238. And the focus of our next episode will examine the renewed Mongol advance into southern and western Rus, including the sieges of key cities like Chernigov and Kiev. We'll also explore how the Mongol leadership adapted its strategy, how the local populations responded, and how the fall of these final Rus strongholds marked the end of organised resistance in the region. I hope you have enjoyed this episode of the history of the Mongols. If you like the content and want to continue to support the series, would you please like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and leave a comment to let me know where in the world you are listening from. Thank you, and see you all next time.